And joining us now is David Pepper, who served as chairman of the Democratic Party of Ohio from 2015 to 2021, and is the author of the new book just out, Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. And he has an article at The Guardian, Republicans are quietly rigging election maps to ensure permanent rule. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Pepper.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us, and frankly, it's refreshing to talk to somebody who got their hair on fire about the biggest issue facing the United States, and that is whether or not we'll have a democracy in a couple of years' time, or whether we'll have the equivalent of Viktor Orban's electoral autocracy in Hungary. And, of course, he was visited recently by Tucker Carlson, and the Republican Party seemed to be perfectly comfortable with instituting voter suppression across the board, along with gerrymandering and the ability, if they don't like the results, which they can certify and count, then they'll put their people in. And they're also very busy at the precinct level, changing the formerly neutral poll workers into partisan Republicans, like the cyber ninjas that did that bogus recount in Arizona. So why isn't the Democratic Party at large, all of the representatives on Capitol Hill, and Americans in general up in arms about this?
I mean, there's a longer-term reason, and then the short-term, I think, is frankly more of a mystery to me. But the longer term is that the forces who really want to undermine democracy have figured out that at the state house level, no one is paying attention. You know, people don't know who their state rep is. They generally don't understand the powers in state houses. So we spend half our time or more, worrying about Trump's every utterance or what Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying, when the truth is there are hundreds of people just like them who are in the majority in state houses passing laws every day undermining democracy. And the reason they're using state houses is because people don't realize it. And so I wrote this book sort of desperately trying to raise attention. Like you said, our hair should be on fire. The institutional damage being done right now at the state level is enormous. And as as anyone who studies our Constitution knows, these states have a huge amount of power over our national democratic process. So if it's in the wrong hands, and in many states it is, they can really do huge damage to our federal process of electing everyone from president to Congress to every level. In the shorter term, though, I will say I continue to be bewildered by the sort of the lack of urgency in the Senate right now. Now, obviously, I think most people support this there, the Democrats at least, but we need to get moving like yesterday on battling back against these attacks on democracy at the states. And when I say attacks on democracy, I'm talking voting rights, gerrymandering, attacks on independent officials like courts. It's as you say, if we saw the combination of things happening at these state houses in another country, we'd actually understand it was attack on democracy. But because it's happening in our own country, we don't see it as that, and that's a huge blind spot that we need to solve immediately.
Well, the press is on it. I mean, the Washington Post has a story today. Trump allies work to place supporters in key election posts across this country, spurring fears about future vote challenges. And it goes on to talk about what's happening in Michigan, where they're appointing people to the election canvass boards. And remember, it was a decent Republican in Michigan who was on the state electoral board to certify the vote. They were called by Trump personally, just as he called Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, and they leaned on them. But this one Republican voted with the majority just by one vote. Otherwise, Michigan would have gone to Trump, or at least it would have been up for grabs. So they've already fixed that now. They put Trump's people in there in Michigan, and in Pennsylvania, they put people on the election boards, voting judges and inspectors who are Stop the Steal believers. And in Colorado, the Stop the Steal believers are urging followers on social media platforms to apply for jobs in election offices. So this is what's happening. Again, I think this is the biggest story out there. And just going back to Capitol Hill, David, haven't they lost the opportunity to do the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? Isn't that?
They haven't lost it. I wish it had been the first thing they'd done out of the gate. Normally you can, as you look at the last, number of Democratic cycles, you can hit very hard early. I wish they had done it. I don't think it's too late, but I think they need to get it done. When there's an urgency, like, approving increasing the debt limit, they seem to show an urgency to all their members, and right now they have to do that here. And I worry that we are sort of the frog in the proverbial pot, and maybe some of them don't see it yet. But I agree, I agree with you on the urgency. It's the biggest story going. The way I think about it is, every election night, America sits down and we have 4 hours of coverage and fancy music of all our elections, right? But you wouldn't know right now that most of those elections are being rigged at the moment. And some newspapers are covering it, some cable news is covering it, but is it on the nightly news the same way that the election results are in November? No. And we go back to Orban. The way that competitive autocracy is so dangerous is the elections are predetermined, but there's a veneer of legitimacy to it. And if we're not careful, we're going to fall into that. And Ohio's lived this for the last decade. 99% of our state house results were predetermined in a hotel room in 2010. That happened all across the country. They're doubling down as you speak. But as you said, now they have 3 years to figure out how to do what they were unable to do for Trump after he lost the election. They tried this too late, and now, as the Post covered and others, they're working very methodically to get themselves in a position to take care of this long before the votes are actually counted. So this is all happening right as we speak, and it is late. It's late in the game, but I still think they can ram it through and hopefully give some protection against what's being worked on by the folks who are against democracy.
And again, I'm speaking with David Pepper, who served as chairman of the Democratic Party of Ohio from 2015 to 2021, and is the author of the new book just out, Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. And he has an article at The Guardian, Republicans are quietly rigging election maps to ensure permanent rule. So let's talk about what they're doing in Ohio, because already they're doing the same in Florida, which we're going to be talking about on Wednesday, and they're also, of course, in Texas as well. So across the country, they're busily rigging the votes in terms of gerrymandering, and the old expression about what's wrong with gerrymandering is quite simply that voters are supposed to choose their politicians, not politicians choosing their voters.
Correct. And here's what's happening that I think people most have not quite seen. The current people in office in most of these state houses themselves have been living in rigged districts their entire career. Very few of them have ever actually, in their own rise to power, gone through any robust, if existent at all, democratic process. So we're talking about a group of people who themselves are disconnected from democracy in their own rise, and they realize that in any world of robust democracy and real elections, they're so extreme, their public outcomes are so bad, that in many ways, in many places like Ohio, there's such high corruption, they would all lose. But they also happen to have their hands on the levers that define the rules of our democracy. So right now, I think we're seeing sort of an acceleration of this way beyond what people realize. And it's because the people themselves in these positions have themselves not been part of a really anything that would mean a definition of democracy. So as Trump and others figured out, these are people who have enough power to really change the way we elect Congress. They can meddle with the choosing of electors for the presidential election. One other thing they're doing right now beyond the high-profile stuff is a lot of state Supreme Courts actually helped assure fair elections last year. Well, guess what? They're meddling with how we elect those Supreme Court justices. In Ohio, they totally changed the rules only a few months ago because an independent court stands as the last sort of protector against what they're doing. So they're doing it in ways that are in the headlines, and they're doing it in ways that are not even covered because there's so much happening at once, and is accelerating again very quickly.
So will the Republicans win back the House before one vote is cast?
I don't think they win it outright, but I think they get a lot closer. And the worry is, and I ran for office in a midterm when we had the White House, the worry is that the broader political environment gets them the rest of the way. And my attitude is, we had massive turnout to elect Obama. We had very good turnout, the highest win ever in terms of votes by Biden. People need to, and this is why I wrote the book, people need to realize that for whatever reasons they were excited about Obama in 2008 and excited about getting rid of Trump in 2020, those reasons and those stakes are just as big in 22. And so if you showed up in those years because you loved Obama, you loved Biden, you were scared of Trump, be scared of the consequences of 22 if they win up and down Congress, State House, Senate. Those will be as dramatic and in a negative way is the excitement about electing Barack Obama. So my hope is that if people are sufficiently motivated, they can show up. And although I would say we're the underdog to not let this happen, but I think there'll still be enough seats we can win to stop the worst case scenario, both on the Senate side and the House side. And again, part of the thesis of my book is, and then make sure you vote all the way through your ballot. These state houses, these state Supreme Court races, all of them have a profound impact on our democracy, but too often only the one side has appreciated that and the other side hasn't been paying as much attention. So vote in huge numbers and vote all the way through that ballot.
Well, you mentioned the 2010 midterms, which were engineered largely by Karl Rove with a lot of money from the American Petroleum Institute and the ALEC, the Koch brothers-backed American Legislative Exchange Council. They really were very effective. Now, that was also, of course, a census year, and we've just had another census, which has ended up with the Democrats losing a couple of seats, one here in Los Angeles, as a matter of fact. So are the Democratic Party, as far as you're concerned, David Pepper, on the ball here in terms of understanding how, hardball the Republicans are? I mean, they don't have a problem with rigging the vote. They would rather cheat than compete. That is a fact. And it's embarrassing. It's depressing. I don't understand why they can call themselves Americans and believe in democracy and do all of the stuff that we all celebrate, the most enduring democracy in the world, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't think we are on offense like they're on offense. And this is not just the Republican Party. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is behind the scenes pulling the strings on all these state houses. It's the Koch brothers. They are on offense against democracy in all 50 states every single year because they realize a robust democracy would mean that sort of the trickle-down, quote-unquote, economic liberty view of democracy that they have wouldn't actually survive if everyone votes in fair elections. So they're on offense against democracy every year at all levels. And Democrats, too often, we're only fighting in certain states in certain years. That's a losing proposition. So I'm doing everything I can to convince people we have to see this as a broader battle for democracy itself. Once you define it that way, then you realize you have to wage that in all 50 states, and you have to wage it every single year, not just in the presidential year, which is normally when Democrats get energized. So I just think that they are playing a different battle with a much more aggressive posture than we are, and we are way behind. They are decades ahead on this. So we don't have a lot of time to come to make up that difference. Now, I think some of the Democratic leadership gets this. I know Jamie Harrison well, the new head of the DNC, he gets this. But I think this has to start at the Senate and the White House, that we cannot allow this window to close in the next 2 years without really robust protection of democracy. And one other thing, the history in our country is very clear. If there are a Jim Crow era coming about is a great, sad case study. If one side is relentlessly attacking democracy at the state level where there's so much power, and the other side is not fighting back as fiercely, and especially if the federal government is not standing in to stop those attacks against democracy succeed. And so it has to be that the federal government has to step up. And then at all levels, we have to redefine right now our politics so that basically it's about saving democracy and energizing people to be involved every single year, or we may lose it, like you're saying.
But surely the American people still understand fairness. So think about it in the terms of an NFL game. Say the Super Bowl. You got hundreds of thousands of people in the stands, millions watching, and the referee when calls the most outrageous call that is so blatantly wrong, and the victory goes to the wrong team. The stadium would be up in arms, and Americans would be furious across the board. They don't like cheaters. So can you name and shame the Republicans? Is there any way for that sense of fairness to become a political weapon?
You know, it's funny you say that is you're right. We actually had two different constitutional amendments on the ballot in Ohio to change the way the maps are drawn here to end gerrymandering. Both passed with around 75% of the vote. So and this has happened in other states like Missouri and others, when voters actually get to choose, do we want a fair system or a rigged system? We generally vote for fairness in overwhelming numbers. The problem is these officials are in jobs that currently they cannot lose. So even in the face of these overwhelming votes in Missouri and Ohio and other states, they still simply ignore it. And so it's got to be both voting and getting on the ballot, anything you can get on the ballot where it's an up or down vote on fairness or democracy. If you run a good campaign, you're going to have a chance of winning. But it's also got to be other ways to really, curtail some of the worst practices. And that's why I think federal legislation, strong enforcement of that legislation from Merrick Garland, real accountability when people cross the line. If you don't throw all that in the mix, we're seeing it in Ohio, in other states. Even when the voters say it's what they want, these people feel so unaccountable in their gerrymandered districts. They're thumbing their nose at literally the constitutions of the states that they took an oath to uphold, but don't seem to understand they have to actually uphold that. So I wish it was just up to the people. It's got to be a combination of things, both elections and otherwise.
Well, David Pepper, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we can keep talking about this. This is so critical. I appreciate that we're on the same page.
Well, thank you, David. And again, I've been speaking with David Pepper, who served as the chairman of the Democratic Party in Ohio from 2015 to 2021, and is the author of the new book just out, Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. And he has an article at The Guardian, Republicans are quietly rigging election maps to ensure permanent rule. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an update on the new Omicron variant spreading around the world, which has alarmed the World Health Organization, but in contrast, a South African doctor who first discovered it claims its symptoms are extremely mild.